Hello and welcome to the education webinars that the Hindu conducts every Saturday at 5 p.m. Today's topic is a little controversial. It's called Sexuality Education in Schools. Um, um, if you were to take stock of education curriculum, we are sort of trying to catch up with the rest of the world. We are introducing AI, robotics, and all kinds of high-tech things. We want India to leapfrog into the developed world by 2047, Vikshit Bharat. And we see our schools and colleges as keys to achieving those goals. So the curriculum is advancing, teaching is advancing, evolving. So many changes are happening. They're being envisioned. But there's one aspect that where the needle doesn't seem to have moved much since the 80s, I suppose, when sex education was sort of introduced gingerly by the by the school boards, and then apparently there was a backlash, and there was this feeling that if you teach about sexuality, then it would mean encouraging school students to have sex, and so there's been a backlash, and it's still a very still a sort of taboo like subject, I believe. There is awareness apparently on sexual violence and to guard against that, and well-being and so on. But sexuality itself, many aspects of it, there are very many aspects to it, and those are not really taught or even exposed to students in schools. To debate this topic, to discuss more and see where we want to go with this, we have a wonderful panel here. Pratisandhi Foundation is dedicated to this topic. Niyati Sharma, she's with us, and Devanshi, who works in the social impact side of education, including in EdTech. She's also collaborated with Pratisandhi Foundation on this topic. They've come up with a white paper. So Devanshi is here, and Rohit, who runs schools. I want to put it short. He has a formal term to it. He does run schools, so he has a direct experience, and he's also here to share his perspectives with us. So let's get rolling. Niyati, tell us what is happening with comprehensive sexuality education and your recent work in this field.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It is lovely to be here with such incredible folks. So, just to set a little bit of context for everybody. So, Pratisandhi Foundation is actually an organization that I had started about 7 years ago. And I was, in fact, still in high school at the time. And I realized that nobody around me was having conversations about sexuality and well-being. So a lot of my friends, myself included, we had questions about relationships, about crushes, and we were going through that adolescent period, and there was just no one to ask questions from. It seemed like our teachers were being very strict about it. It felt like it wasn't a conversation you could have in the household. And in fact, I had gone on an exchange program when I was still in school, and this was in Belgium, where they actually did a survey. It was a national survey that was being done to understand, safe sexual practices among adolescents. And it was completely mind blowing to me because I felt, as a 16-year-old, oh, they're asking these questions so openly, and there is discussion around contraception and safe behavior and violence prevention and so on. So, when I came back to India after that exchange program, I went to my mother, who's a gynecologist, and I said, what do you think about this? Like, people talk about it openly outside, and what are your thoughts? And she, as a doctor, told me that, I get a lot of young patients who find themselves in difficult positions like teenage pregnancies or STIs or, abusive relationships. And very often they don't even recognize that what has happened because they often lack the language to convey that. So that's kind of where the idea behind Pratisandhi had started. And initially, I had just kind of made this Instagram page where we collected anonymous questions from young people. And we said, okay, if you have questions, we have a doctor on board, which was my mother, and we looped in some of her friends as well. And so we said, okay, if you send us questions, we will try and get them vetted for accuracy and post the responses. So it was kind of our own version of a sexuality education column, if you will. And Instagram was still in its nascent stages at the time, in terms of uptake. So, that's kind of how we began, and we started noticing a lot of trends in the kinds of questions that young people were asking. So we started doing workshops, and we started trying to respond to those needs, and really started thinking about, okay, well, if somebody had run educational programming for me on this, what do I wish I would have known? Because for me personally, in school, all we had was like this middle school workshop on menstrual hygiene, which, thankfully, I think there's been a lot of uptake around menstrual hygiene now. But a couple of years ago, that was not the case. But that was really the only programming we got around well-being. And then even then, it was separated girls and boys, a basic session on how to use pads, and then we just kind of moved on. So our real goal was to try and change that. And over the years, we've worked with a lot of different schools across the country. We work with thousands of young people and answered their questions around sexuality education. And I think a few things I keep coming back to, which I would love to share, is, first is, of course, sexuality education is incredibly misunderstood. I think, of course, we call it sex ed. There's a lot of different terms for it. You might call it adolescent well-being, you might call it reproductive education, you might call it life skills, you might call it values. But really, at the end of the day, I think whenever we say the word sexuality or sex, immediately our mind goes to this very vulgar, almost pornographic depictions, But that's really not what sexuality education is, especially at the school level. You wouldn't go to a 12-year-old or a 14-year-old and immediately start talking about sex in its, in the way we conceive of it. Normally, with sexuality education, you would have a very age appropriate and developmentally appropriate conversation. So, as a child approaches adolescence, you would start having conversations about puberty, about safety, about respect for one another, about understanding differences between their peer groups and how to navigate those changes. It also includes how to manage not just relationships at a later stage, but also your friendships, your feelings, things like jealousy. All of those things have a role to play in our adult relationships as well. And so it's really about creating the foundation and that information foundation for the students in an age appropriate way as well as in a culturally appropriate way. So the sexuality education that would maybe happen in the UK or the US is not the same conversation that will happen in India. So I think sexuality education is just so fundamentally misunderstood. There's this idea that, if we will talk to people about sex, or if we introduce the topic of sex to kids, they will immediately start having sex. But in fact, research has consistently found that not to be the case, that whenever we have actual thought through comprehensive sexuality education programming, which is not done in a one-off way and actually makes space for conversation, it actually leads to delayed sexual initiation, it leads to decline in teenage pregnancies, lower rates of STIs, and young people are actually able to make more informed decisions about their bodies, which is really our end goal, right? Like, what parent or what teacher does not want young people to be safe? And we want young people to be able to make those decisions critically and thoughtfully for their own self. Like, even if they go to a doctor, they should be aware of their rights, right? And if they're entering a relationship, as an adult, they should know what the lines are. They should know how to draw their boundaries, be assertive about their boundaries, and not feel guilty about them. I remember, I had done a workshop. This was in a Delhi school, and it was a ninth grade girl, and she, during one of our programming and our conversations, one of the questions that she asked was, is it okay to say no to sex? And I think that is just, it's such an important question, because it really made me think, okay, where is this question coming from, right? And why are we in a position where a girl who's about 14 years old does not feel like she can actually say no to sex, or feels like she needs somebody's permission or validation to tell her that, hey, it's okay to say no? So I think it is just as much about the other side of it. And when we conceive of sexuality education, sometimes we're only visualizing the idea that, oh, everybody's going to want to do it and they will be curious, and curiosity has a side to it, of course. But I think it's also just as much about those boundaries and empowering young people to draw those boundaries for themselves. So no matter what one calls it, whether you call it adolescent well-being or social and emotional learning, I think as long as those comprehensive elements are there, quite frankly, I'm not very picky about terminology. But I think, unfortunately, often, this terminology becomes a cop out for us to only focus on certain aspects, but not really focus on the others. And I think India has a very vast population, so I think it's a relatively sexually active population. So I think there's definitely a need to destigmatize these conversations. Just a few days ago, I got a call from a parent who was telling me about, when is the right age to talk to my kids about this? How do I talk to them about it? When is the time when a sibling, like a brother and sister, should be in separate rooms? How do I talk to them about that? So I think it is very much an ecosystem challenge. It's not just something young people have questions about, but it is very much something that parents and teachers and the whole system around the young person is also really grappling with. Like a lot of our work with teachers, we see, they're trying to balance their own stigma where they think, okay, I said XYZ to a child, but maybe not realizing that that was coming from a place of bias. Whenever we go to classrooms and we talk to teachers and we say, oh, do you think you've ever accidentally stereotyped a child? And all the teachers will say, no, we have never ever stereotyped anybody. And then we show them the same surveys that we ran with the students in the same school, and 80-90% of the kids will say they have felt stereotyped. And then we kind of have a reflection session with the teachers who tell us, oh, I didn't think about it like that. So I think it is a reflective space just as much for us as adults, and we are also on that learning journey when it comes to sexuality, because so many of us did not have this education growing up, and India will need to figure out what it means for them, whatever terminology works. But how do we make it comprehensive? How do we pull young people and even adults out of this system that often puts so much guilt and so much awkwardness on them, that, oh my god, how did I even think about this? Why did this thought cross my mind? Does it make me a bad person? But it's only normal, natural sexual development. So in any case, this was some of the conversations that we were having at the India Sexuality Education Summit that we just recently did. And we were actually in fact grateful to have government partners join us and share their perspective. We had an advocate from the Supreme Court, Mr. Grover, who came and shared the court's perspective, who have been really batting for sexuality education of late, especially in the context of POCSO and child safety. So lots of learnings there. And of course, I will pass on to Devanshi, in fact, to share a little bit about the white paper that we had recently released at this event, which was a culmination of the questions that we got from young people. So yeah, I think that's it from my side, but of course, happy to keep having this conversation.
Thanks for that excellent intro. Gave us a good idea of what schools are missing, perhaps. I invite Devanshi now. Tell us more about this white paper, and let's get to the specifics.
Thanks, everyone. Lovely to be here. I think picking up from what Niyati said, right, there has been some progress, and the pockets of progress vary based on state to state. Of course, the terminology differs across state to state. I think one common question we were facing when designing programs when it comes to sexuality education is, how do we know what the child is not aware of? So that was really the gap in terms of appropriate data coming directly from children. I think that is exactly what the white paper wanted to establish. So as part of these sessions, what we typically do towards the end of the session, we ask students to give us questions. And because these are topics where I don't want to, raise hands or don't want to get up, these questions come to us in form of chits. Children really write down questions on chits. They send the chits to us. So what we really did is we digitized all these questions, which is some repository around 600 to 700 questions. And then the idea was that across these 600 questions, what are some common topics? So I think it was very, very, very reflective for us to see that across all our sessions, there have been some common topics, and there have been some topics which are very alarming, which need redressal. And when it comes to the gamut of topics, typically when people talk about sexuality education, it gets reduced to, let's say, reproduction, biology, or anatomy. But a lot of our questions were around emotional well-being, around what is the difference between consent and boundary. Also on the lines of legality, a lot of questions that we get posed are, why is 18 the age of consent and not 16, for example? So it's like a variety of questions which goes far beyond reproduction or far beyond anatomy. And one important point which really our programs should reflect is the fact that all of these are interconnected, which is to say that you cannot isolate a menstruation and teach it as a 60-minute period in school and not talk about related topics. That is, again, another reflection for us that these are not isolated topics. We really need to talk to them together. I think one thing which I really want to highlight is the gaps that we found across all these questions. And so to see these gaps are consequential. So it typically starts with something that we call the conceptual gap. This is typically a gap where students are not aware. they lack the information, or they don't know whom to ask about this. And in cases where there is no official source of information, what students or children usually resort to is, let's say, what they see on the internet, or what is shown in movies or streaming platforms, or what they have learned culturally. So one is the basic foundation layer where there is no knowledge or awareness about concepts. I think the second one, which is really not being thought about correctly in the Indian context, is a recognition gap. This gap typically is that a child is aware. The child is aware, let's say, that the child is feeling uncomfortable, but the child is not able to interpret it, or the child is not able to translate that into words and communicate it to an adult, which is a big gap. A lot of students have asked us, how do I talk about this? How do I walk up to my teacher and ask about this? Do you think my parent will be okay if I ask my parent about this? So these are questions where children are aware or have some basic information, but they don't know how to translate this. This thing really affects their recognition of what is risky versus not. A lot of questions that we get asked is this normal? Should I be doing this? Am I a bad person if I do this? So I think that is a recognition gap where they have part information and they're not able to contextualize that information for the situation that they are in. And the third one, of course, is the skill gap, which is to say that, okay, a child knows what consent is. A child knows that I'm in a situation where I should be asking for consent. But the skill gap is a child doesn't know how to ask for it. A lot of questions across all our categories have been what to do about this. How do I go and talk about this? Should I even ask this? Am I allowed to ask this? And this really shows the lack of some kind of structured programming. And when we say structured programming, the elements really include some practical tools. Tools, for example, what is some framework to recognize harm? What are some frameworks to understand what is unhealthy relationship? So this is the three main layers. I think the top layer for us has been the need for a systemic push. And when we say systemic push, I think one category that we have seen across all our questions has been structural barriers, which is to say that children don't have safe spaces to go and ask about. They're aware that school is one place. They are aware that parents are one place where they can go and ask questions, but somehow they don't feel that those places are either accessible or they feel those places are confidential. This is a structural barrier in the sense that the limited knowledge that students then have is to talk to their peers, and peers typically often have the same range of knowledge. So these four layers are so interconnected, and it's so difficult to really point out and say that, okay, the child is suffering through what. But I think the programs that we kind of design around this should actually reflect all of these four layers. So it should just not be giving information or spreading awareness. It should also be, how does a child apply this? It should also be taking this in real situations and discussing that, okay, tomorrow if you face this is something that you can do. So I think it's a gamut of questions that have come to us, and very happy to share that this is really the data from students who have access to information, who have access to internet, who have formal schooling structures in place, and they're still curious and concerned about topics. So I think I will leave at that, but I really invite everybody who is, today come here to listen to us, that if you're a parent, if your child goes to school, you should really go back and ask your children that, what are you being taught in school? You should really go back and ask the school, are you teaching my child these topics, and how are you teaching these? So yeah.
Excellent. We will come back to you for more. I ask Rohit, who runs schools. Rohit, tell us, how do schools look at it? And we heard from the experts. Now I'm not saying you're not an expert, but let's hear the school side of the picture and what have been your efforts.
Thank you, Devanshi, Niyati, and Sir Kalyan, sir. So honor and privilege to be here today. Thank you, everyone, for giving me this opportunity. So my name is Rohit. I'm the CEO for the foundation called Safe Schools. I'm also the academic director for a group of schools in Chennai. The last 10 years, I've been on the ground in various capacities as a teacher, as a principal, and I've now decided to do this as my life's mission purpose, for the lack of a better word. The why behind this is, I'm going to break this into like two big things. One is personal and one is more macro. My personal why is, as a kid, I was bullied a lot in school, and I never knew what to do. Like, what do you actually do when somebody bullies you? Who do you talk to? Am I allowed to talk? I think, as Niyati rightly mentioned, kids ask these questions. Is it even right to think? Is this my right? Can I talk to somebody? And I'm sure all of us in some way or the other have been bullied in school, but maybe we didn't know what to do or who to talk to. And so that was one thing that it did affect my confidence. I did stammer and stutter a lot in school. Got better with time, but I think that was one thing, and I never really understood what to do about it. The second one is when I started teaching, and the more I interacted with my students, some of them came from very, very some horrific backgrounds, issues of them being hit, being burnt by people in their community, and cases of child marriage, which is still prevalent, and I didn't know what to do, and I genuinely felt like this was. I felt helpless, and kids bullying and hitting each other. There's nothing was working, and I really felt like something needs to be done. And so I started getting trained in what do you do to build that culture of safety in a school. Start with the school, and then hopefully work for the system. Started doing some research. Realized that countries like UK and Singapore have really figured out how to do this really well. Got trained by a person in the UK. And really understood that we have a long way to go, but it's possible. Also, the reason why I know that this is something that's possible is India fixed bullying in colleges quite well. We took that as a very, very serious issue, and it actually got fixed, which means that we actually can fix safety in schools as well. And so got trained and realized that safety is not just about talking about your bodies or bullying and stuff. There's a whole sort of ecosystem to it. You start from your emotions, then you move on to your boundaries, your personal boundaries, other people's boundaries, then consent, and then there's a bit of sexuality, identity, and all of that comes together, and only then that's a comprehensive safety education or comprehensive sexuality education, whatever term you want to use, right? And so it's like saying I learn addition without learning numbers. So and that's currently what's happening. One-off sessions are happening in schools. Where we just talk about the law, like this is the POXO law, this is what RTE says, this is what the law says, but then that's not enough. You have to start from the foundations, you have to go to the basics and start from there, and then with time you have these conversations, kids build their confidence, they understand who do you talk to, what do you do if somebody treats me in a bad way, who do I talk to, and that's basically what we're trying to do. We've built books right now, which we're piloting in like 8 schools this year. From UKG to grade 12. The idea being just like how we have math and English, the entire time they're in school, they need to be having these conversations from the time they're in KG till they leave school. And it's a progressive curriculum that we're trying to build. And while also keeping in mind, how do you do this without overburdening the teachers? As a teacher, I know that teachers are very, very overwhelmed and overburdened in schools, but this is also not something we can say it's the responsibility of just the principal or just the parent. All of us are responsible for this, including the children. So that's basically what we're trying to do at Safe Schools. We're trying to work with schools to help them understand how do you approach safety, how do you create that culture of safety, talk to students about the same concepts that Niyati spoke about, while also empowering the system and students to reach out and get their questions and problems addressed. A few barriers that we're still facing, and I think that's something that Kalyan sir wanted me to talk about. One is this is still considered a topic of morality, where it's a right or wrong thing, and therefore if I don't believe in it, I don't need to do this in my school. I think it's the same as when we talk about English and math or science. The minute we look at it as, hey, this is factual, this is something that a child needs to know, just as important as math and English and sciences, this is equally important. And unless I have that basic awareness of my own body, of my own rights, understanding consent, understanding how do I treat myself and others around me, only then will I be an upstanding citizen in the future, and I'll contribute more and more in a more productive manner. And we're seeing this in the news. There's so much of power imbalance that we're seeing between men, women, and so that's coming out as different forms of abuse. And unless we talk about it in schools, we're going to have more and more of these cases in the future. And I think that's kind of the problem that all of us cumulatively here are trying to solve. Let it not reach a point where it becomes I don't want to say it, but a really, really bad situation in the future. But can we stop it? Can we talk about it in schools? Can we empower children right from day one of them entering the school and work with the parents and teachers and stop this from becoming a pandemic, for the lack of a better word? And that's really what we're trying to do. So that one barrier is the fact that it's still a morality-based discussion where I have the choice to talk about this in the classroom. The second barrier I would say still remains that unless this comes as a mandate from the government that this has to be taught in every single classroom, there is going to be that barrier where schools will prioritize the examination, like, they have English, I have math, I have science, I have socials, therefore I don't have time to squeeze this into the timetable. That barrier still remains. It's still schools that really believe that this is important. They're giving us time, but what about the 95, 98% of schools that are still not talking about this? That still needs to become a government mandate. There is positive news from the NEP where the mandate is that wellness is a very, very important aspect of a child's development, is something that the government has recognized, and that's a good positive step. But wellness is still defined largely in the idea of socio-emotional learning, which is a good first step, but we still have to look at comprehensive sexuality education as a component of that. I think over the next 5 to 10 years, education boards like CBSE are going to be releasing circulars and mandates on how to get this implemented. We are working with CBSE schools, and we realize that every week there's a new mandate on something. I'm quite positive and hoping that this is going to continue, and even things like sexuality education is going to become an important thing for the future, and schools will be, for the lack of a better word, again, mandated to talk about this. And I think that's what we can hope for. And the minute that happens, I think we all need to be prepared to actually take this forward. And that's hopefully what all of us here are trying to do. So I think these are two barriers. Like I said, one is the government, the other one is the morality-based aspect of this whole thing. The third barrier is, I think, still, unless, or at least the work that we have done, we've seen success only when the school leader wants to fix this. If the school leader or any of the teachers are not interested in talking about these things in the classroom, when we talk about these things to the students just say, what's the point? You're talking about all this to us, but the adults around us are not really listening, or they still hit us, or they still treat us, or they bully us, and they still shame us. So I think until we reach a point where we all work on this together, that's not to say that we will only work with schools where people are already aligned, but that's still a barrier. And I think we need to look at it as something that all of us need to think about. How do we change together so that our children get the best education that they can? So yeah, I think the least problematic of all this is children. I think children, no matter what backgrounds they come from, whatever biases that they already may have, they immediately understand the importance of consent. They immediately understand, what the impact bullying does on a child, on themselves, on people around them. And they ask questions that probe you to think in the way that, what, maybe I'm right, or maybe you're wrong. And I think children are, at the end of the day, are amazing. They will understand what we're trying to tell them, as long as we're very clear that this is something that that every child should learn about. A few things that has given me confidence that kids will process this and understand this. One is, when we've done these sessions in the classroom, we've realized that kids always come back with questions about, and I was telling this to the panel even before the meeting started, they already know everything that you're telling them. It's just a question of, they're trying to test if you know what they know, because it's everywhere. It's on social media. It's in movies. They already see everything that's related to sexuality and sex and consent and boundary violations. They already see it. The problem is, no one's telling them where is the line where it's bad, and I'm not using the word bad, but where is it unsafe and where is it safe? And I think that's our only job, is to help them understand each other's boundaries and tell them what is safe and unsafe. Media is there, and the perception that if we talk about this, they'll have sex. I think that's wrong, because they're already getting this information somewhere. So at least with us, if we are talking about this in schools, they will get the right information. They'll get the information that's backed by science and data, and they're not getting half-baked information from Google or some random website. And I think as long as we acknowledge that they're already aware of this, we treat them as adults and say, hey, you know this. Here are some things that I want you to think of. Facilitate the conversation rather than telling them what is right or wrong. I think there'll be a lot more success in these programs. So yeah, I think that's basically what I wanted to cover. And I think I saw a couple of questions where it said what age to start. I just want to start with that. You can start as soon as a kid, starts to have conversations. I think that itself is a good place to start. But yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, I have a follow-up question. I just found that we have Deepak Dwivedi. This is not a question, but he's sort of saying what he's doing. He's head education policy and knowledge innovation international process excellence council. He's saying we're working on a NEP 2030 draft. I feel this topic can be covered in the forthcoming NEP in 2030 as part of policy. So if it were to be part of NEP is more a guideline. It's up to the boards to do it, but still, if NEP 2030 were to have this, were to have comprehensive sexuality education explicitly mentioned, discussed, and detailed, what would it be? What are the various aspects of it?
I mean, I can kick us off if you'd like.
Yeah,
I mean, I think there's quite a few aspects to it, but I think a great place to start, I think with sexuality education, it often feels like we're reinventing the wheel. It's like, oh, it's such a brand new topic, or like there's so much to cover. How do we cover it? But quite frankly, there is thousands and thousands of curriculums out there that already address sexuality education in different ways and forms. I mean, the UN had released a international guideline for sexuality education, and it details age by age what should kids at this age know, what should kids at this age know, and it goes all the way up to 18. And I will say, of course, I don't think that those guidelines are fully contextual to India. That's what we have found. So internationally, what the recommendation might be for, say, a kid who's 15 years of age, I think that is a conversation, at least right now in India, we'd be seeing with a slightly older adolescents, and that's just based on what they're exposed to and the norms around them are. But I think that's an incredible guideline to go off of, and I think we already have so much of this information. Same with the white paper that we have released, and I think Devanshi might be able to speak to this more. But some of the very, very common themes that we did see come up, so for instance, bodily autonomy, I think, is a theme that regularly keeps coming up. What do I do in cases of violence regularly comes up. Media literacy regularly comes up. Biology, reproduction is, again, even though this is in fact biology and reproduction is still part of curriculum already, and even then we see the most basic questions come back from students. So I think the themes that come under sexuality education are fairly well understood, and I think there are so many resources out there, and I don't want to take away time by detailing every single one, but I think that is one part of it. I think there's already a lot of curriculum in place. The other side of it is, I think, pedagogy, because it is one thing to have information and it's another thing to practice that information, right? So even if you like go to a kid and say, oh, you had learned about reproduction, like, can you actually look at a diagram and tell me what it is and how it is and how it works? A lot of the kids will not be able to, because what they have been taught is to replicate it for their exams and then forget about it. So that real life connect is almost completely missing, even for things that are already in curriculum. So something that we learned from the white paper and from doing all these programs with kids is that you have to give them an opportunity to practice all of these things, right? So if I'm saying, oh, you should be able to question what you are reading in the media or what you're seeing on TV, we need to make space for them to actually come up with those questions and engage when it comes to that, right? One conversation I remember having in classrooms with, especially boys and girls, they were having a back and forth about what is a green flag and red flag. And there were very gendered responses in what they thought was green and red. And we were seeing a lot of polarization. But it was having that opportunity for them to critically engage with each other and have back and forth without a facilitator or a teacher come in and say, no, you are right, you are wrong, this is right, and that is wrong. To allow them to come to that outcome and answer themselves. And I think that speaks a lot to how we teach, not just what it is that we're teaching.
Okay, we'll have a question. Does comprehensive He's asking a counterintuitive question. He's asking, does comprehensive sexuality education lead to delayed initiation of sexual intercourse, increased use of contraception when active, and decreased rates of HIV and unintended pregnancies? The general idea is you talk about sex, you'll have sex. So that is going to not delay, it's going to speed up the initiation of sexual contact or intercourse. But he's asking the counter question. Is that true?
I can answer this. So I think, sorry, you wanted to go?
Always.
All right. Sure. So yeah, I think there's enough data and evidence to suggest that there is definitely the unintended pregnancies will go down. That's for sure, and the increased use of contraception as well. Again, the reason why the comprehensive sexuality education is not done is there is a little bit of morality and religion that comes into this, which is again, I think something that's a different discussion altogether. But definitely the data says that when we talk about contraception and we talk about the correct form of comprehensive sexuality education, use of contraceptives and pregnancies will come down. Whether it and the opposite also is I would say not true, where by talking about this, are kids having more sex? There's no evidence suggests that there is any correlation between those two. This is my understanding and what data I have seen, but would love to hear the other two panelists as well talk about it and see if there's any other data.
Yeah, I think one important point over here is also to not look at it as a binary idea of whether giving education will cause them to be more curious. I think the idea really is to give them enough information to make informed decisions. I think a lot of questions really go around, okay, can I just say yes or no to a child, whether something is right or wrong? But the deeper idea is that you want them to become responsible adults, which means that you want them to give the information and also some frameworks which will help them take decisions, which is not to say that I guide the answer for them, but which is to say that I create those spaces where they have the opportunity to reflect. So I think just looking at this question in a binary lens also takes away the deeper issue, which is to say that are we creating children or adolescents who can take decisions for themselves, and the decisions have to be informed. So I think the larger idea of giving some kind of sexuality education is to provide this information which can really lead to some kind of informed decision making.
Niyati, would you like to go, or shall we move on?
I mean, I think everything's already been addressed, but no, I concur. I think there's a lot of research that already speaks to CSE's role in delaying, age of sexual initiation. And so I think that has been quite established. And I would love to see a large-scale pilot in India as well. Unfortunately, a lot of the research we rely on, comes from outside of India because we just haven't had the opportunity to necessarily pilot it at such a large scale. But there are organizations in India as well who've done very similar work and who have seen that structured education, which is very similar to comprehensive sexuality education, or, basically that without calling it that, has actually led to norm change and behavioral change and attitude shifts. In fact, in some of the research and some of the work done by organizations like Breakthrough, they've seen, in fact, increase in, marriage age in specific communities. So I think that research very much exists.
Okay. Vaibhav Saini, given how early children are exposed to information online today, including unsafe or abusive content, how do educators and psychologists determine the appropriate age to introduce topics related to sexuality in schools? And how can schools ensure the education is age appropriate while also helping protect children from harmful misinformation they may encounter online? When do you start? At what age? What class?
I mean, for us, we start as young as possible, quite frankly. So, I mean, all the way from, I think generally programming with schools for us has started grade 3 onwards. Grade 1 and 2, sometimes there is a bit of a gap in terms of, getting some of those initial concepts across. But I think it can still very much be done. Depends on your pedagogical approach. But we start very young. So I think grade 3 onwards, we'll start talking about, private, not private, safe, not safe. What are the right names for like my anatomy, calling them what it is, instead of using random slang for it. So we kind of start from that age, and then it just kind of continues. We've done programming with adults who are like 40, 50 years of age. So I think it's a big, large continuum, which is not just limited to young people.
Yeah, so I think similar to Niyati, our program starts from grade 3 onwards, but the reason being that for LKG, UKG, grade 1 and 2, information like this is best when it comes from somebody that they already know and see every single day, like their homeroom teacher. So what we're doing is giving them books that they can sort of do in the classroom. And with respect to, how do you determine what topics and what age, it's the same as defining a curriculum for a child, right? So you break down the overall curricular goals for the entire for all the topics, break it down into age-wise and then year-wise, and then we sort of decide what goes in what age. If there are parents here who would like to read a little bit more, Tarshi, there's an organization called Tarshi, which has published some fantastic books for parents and for children. So children themselves can read it, parents also can read, and how do you introduce these topics, what age do you start, how do you have these difficult conversations at home? So if there are parents here who would like to sort of read up a little bit and understand a little bit more, that's one place that I would start if I were you.
I think one small point over here is also to understand that this is not going to be a curriculum which stays the way it is. It will need refinements and updating. I think one important point that even the senior advocate Anand Grover, who attended our event, he mentioned that puberty, the age of puberty, is hitting early, which means that traditionally, if my child was taught about, let's say, for example, body or reproduction or menstruation at the age of 14, that can't be 14. Now it has to be earlier. So I think an important point to also note is that your curriculum has to be in tandem with the reality and the realities of how bodies are changing in this context. So I think that is one very important way to kind of establish what is the correct age. And second is what we called building up on the curriculum, which is to say that I do not introduce consent directly in the grade 8 and teach them how to ask for consent in a physical activity. We introduce consent very early on. And the questions we take typically in grade 3, grade 4 are on the lines of, can I take a book from my friend's bag without asking? So I think that is also very important, that topics do not get introduced directly at an age where accepting them, understanding them, or reflecting on them is difficult, but you really start early on. And then the kind of examples that they encounter or they are taught, that kind of progresses as the curriculum progresses.
Okay, we have questions. I think many teachers are logged in. What kind of structure, training, and institutional support do teachers need to move beyond discomfort and deliver sexuality education confidently and responsibly? One of the most important questions we've got so far.
I think I can go first for this one. So I think number one, this needs to be part of the B.Ed training. I think that's something that the NEP has spoken about. Teacher training being a lot more structured and better, instead of right now it's very unstructured. Teachers can get a B.Ed even by not going to college. So I think that's something we need to change as a country. Our training needs to be a lot more structured, effective, and we start these concepts right there in college. So that's one. I think the second is giving teachers themselves the space to talk about these for their own personal lives, for that matter. So having learning circles in schools where teachers come together and talk a little bit more about, because unless they have the confidence to talk about these things amongst themselves, they're not going to talk about it to children, because it's, again, there's a little bit of that thing of I'm the teacher, you're the student. And so if you don't, topics like this can be especially a little bit more tricky to talk about. So can they talk about it first with people that they know, their peer groups, get that initial awkwardness out of the way, and then we bring it into the classroom. So I think these are two ideas that we are grappling with. We're trying to see how do we work with B.Ed colleges, number one, and number two, give teachers spaces to talk about these before they enter the classroom and teach these concepts. I think these are two things that we can think of.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you were talking about, I think it's very important to have that institutional support. So I think the conversation around leadership supporting you in this process is very important, because I think teachers are in a very precarious position where they are, of course, answerable to parents who will then kind of show up to classrooms and be like, oh, did you say this, did you say that? And so especially with a topic like this, the room and the leeway to potentially make mistakes, even when you're doing any kind of communication around it, is very low. There's almost no scope for saying the wrong thing, because you will have a kid who will take it to heart and like run with it, which I think goes for quite a lot of themes as well. So I think giving teachers that room to explore it themselves and having that institutional support, because I think without leadership backing them and without them kind of visualizing a way in which it is actually implemented, rather than saying, oh, here's a new curriculum, why don't you just go and implement it, I don't think that's going to work. We do need to have self-reflection as well. Something like gender stereotyping, we've done so many trainings with teachers, and teachers tell us consistently, we've had this training about it, we've had that training, we have refreshers every year. And yet when we run reflective circles, we will still have teachers come up with examples of, their own behavior or in their own households that they had not previously thought of before. So again, like I say, that it's not just about what you're saying, it is how you are saying it and how you're understanding it yourself. And you really need the backing of where you work and the context you work in, because if your peers or other teachers are not supporting you, then not only is that giving mixed signals to the child in the classroom, but also to you as the teacher.
Okay, Simran Joshi has a question. How can gamification be effectively used in CSE for adolescents and young adults while ensuring age appropriate and ethical visual representation?
I can kick us off if you like. I'm always on the fence about this because I feel that, gamification and digital tools work for very motivated groups, right? So, for example, if you have an online course on any topic, even for sexuality education, or even something like math or physics, even, anyone who's doing an online version of anything needs to be somewhat motivated to engage in it. And a lot of gamification, runs through like apps and products and so on. And this is not to say they are not fantastic, but I think that the audience they're trying to reach has to be incentivized in the right ways as well, which can be a little bit tricky for comprehensive sexuality education. I don't think ethical visual representation is honestly as big of a challenge as we make it out to be. There's some fantastic resources like Amaze, who are an international organization but have translated and work with a domestic partner in India to translate videos into regional languages. And you should see the imagery that they use. It is very, very kid friendly, very lovely imagery, nothing that is vulgar in any way, shape, or form, but can still get across very critical CSE topics to kids as well as to parents. On our end at Pratisandhi, we recently launched a card game that is meant for younger adolescents to play along with their parents. So it's something that you play as a family and has kind of prompts to start that conversation at home. And we've tested it out with adults, and we still even see adults kind of saying, "Oh, I hadn't thought about this in this way." So I think there is a lot of scope for gamification. Now, how comprehensive a game can be is, I think, a question, because CSE is quite vast. But I think it can be a fabulous starting point, and I highly recommend also looking at Amaze videos if anyone is keen to kind of start that conversation.
I also feel, adding to what Niyati said, we are still in the early stages of, kind of giving sexuality education to the right students at the right age. So I think if you have to take this one notch down, it would rather also be that how do I teach important topics in a way that feels less harmful or less serious or less jarring to kids. So I think one typical example that we use is when we teach menstruation to, let's say, a grade 4 or a grade 5, the concept, we really don't go about with the entire anatomy in the first go. We usually give a hotel example, which is to say that a guest has come to the hotel, the guest is going to stay for 2 days. If the guest leaves, then this is this. If the guest does not leave, then this is what the situation is. So I think before gamification, we can also take it a notch down to really understand that if I have to teach these concepts to children as young as grade 4, grade 5, how can I make it more creative, more innovative, and more analogy driven?
Okay. Alima Saeed, she's asking, how can working parents, yes, how can working or otherwise, yeah, but she's talking about working parents. How can working parents educate their children regarding sex ed? Because we can see that teens are already aware about sex, not from their parents in school, but from reels and social media. Therefore, it always becomes a point where most of us hesitate to speak.
Yeah, so I think, as you rightly mentioned, they already know about it. Unfortunately, most teens, when they've understood what they've understood about sex in how it's portrayed in media or in pornography, is largely patriarchal, and it's very, very power based, where you have usually the storyline that's depicted about sex is there's a guy chasing a girl and the girl eventually gives in, and I think that sort of gives many students a very unhealthy perception of what sex is. And I think I've mentioned before, a good place to start is reading up on how these conversations can be had at home. There's, like I said, Tarshi is one resource. There's also a very interesting book called Hey, Let's Talk About Sex. It's, I think, an Indian author. I forgot the name of the author. So that's one more. There are enough resources online, but I think just asking your kids a little bit about, what have they learned about it is a good place to start, and just listen to their perception and then ask questions and not give them the right answer. I think that usually helps about talking about these things, where it's not a black and white thing of, hey, this is what it is, this is right, this is wrong, as opposed to, as Niyati mentioned, the pedagogy could be a lot more facilitator based and question oriented, where you're asking them questions to understand and then you build off from that, and hoping that, by asking these questions, the understanding can slowly change towards a more healthy understanding of what sex is and what sexuality is all about.
Yeah, also just to quickly add, I think we also tend to sometimes overcomplicate it. I think generally when we say, parents should be having conversations about sexuality education, we are not saying that, you should, especially in the context of older adolescents, nobody's saying, have conversations about sex lives, for instance. I think we're really talking about very fundamental values like empathy and respect and decision making, which I see some of the questions here. It does absolutely have a link with social and emotional learning. And I think for parents, I think there's two very easy ins. And I think the first one is modeling. Your kids are going to learn what you do. They learn pretty much by seeing how parents interact with each other, how they interact with their peers, how they talk about their peers behind their peers' backs. So I think a lot of that learning happens just by seeing parents. So I think if you want to have sort of more positive attitudes around sexuality, then it does need to come from the parents. Even if there's no direct conversation, a lot of modeling goes into it. So how you react to something, how you discuss the news, how you discuss media pieces around them, whether you, even if you don't discuss them, that is also a form of modeling, because that sends the message that this is not appropriate to talk about. And I think related to that, the second piece is to have opportunities to talk. So if you go and you see a movie, you then maybe have a conversation and say, oh, what did you think about the storyline? Speaking to the example that was just being shared, what did you think about the storyline? Did you think it was good? Did you think maybe it could have been done differently? What do you think a more healthy or a nicer outcome would have been if you were in that position, right? Did we think about like agency? And you don't have to necessarily use the jargon words that like I'm using right now just to get the concept across. But I think it's those everyday conversations where destigmatization happens. It is not, a secondary curriculum that parents should be expected, in fact, even to impart at home. That's how we teach anything, right? That's how we teach our social norms. That's how we teach our culture. And sexuality education is essentially just part and parcel, and it's taught in the same way.
I think at Pratisandhi, we've also kind of realized that parents do not have that kind of resources or the space to reflect. So what we also do is we do sessions with parents as well, which is where it's only the facilitators and parents in a room. And the idea really is to understand where are they struggling, what are the kind of questions their children are asking, and also to kind of give them the confidence of what we're teaching their child. So become that point of spaces that parents also need to have. I think schools can also be a good forum of getting the parents together and letting them discuss even amongst themselves about these topics.
Current sexuality, Deepak Dwivedi, who's working on the draft NEP 2030, his question is: current sexuality education largely focuses on biology, abuse prevention, and risk avoidance from a behavior excellence perspective. How can schools help students distinguish between the gross dimensions of desire, impulsivity, objectification, digital addiction, and coercion, and the subtle dimensions such as emotional maturity, responsibility, self awareness, respect, and ethical relationships? How can NEP 2030 address this? No one wants to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to come in if nobody else wants to jump in. But I think Rohit would have quite a bit to share on this as well, I'm sure. I think, I mean, honestly, my first instinct is, of course, definitely not necessarily like in your teaching, not necessarily phrasing it in that exact way, because at least in my work with adolescents, I have found like if I go into a classroom and say, look, this is bad, and this is just what we want to like be going away from, and we don't want you to be like objectifying and so on, yes, that might still be my end goal. But I think if I go and phrase it that way to an adolescent, they will receive it quite differently. So I think it is definitely something we were talking about as well, was to allow the students to come to those conclusions themselves and to have those critical reflecting spaces. So again, I mean, for me, a lot of it keeps going back to the pedagogy of it all, because you cannot just go into a classroom and say, okay, kids, like, this is bad and that kind of addiction is bad. And we've all gone to like these drug abuse assemblies and everything in schools, and I think they have their space, but I feel that they're not always as impactful in allowing students to come to those conclusions by themselves and to critically reflect. Because okay, I've told you that something is maybe not the best outcome in one set of circumstances, but are you able to generalize and apply that same thinking and framework in a different context? And I think that's really what we want them to take away in comprehensive sexuality education, because you can't possibly answer every single question and every single scenario that an adolescent or a young person will face in their lives. So I think it is about really getting them to come to those conclusions themselves. So we do a lot of like, we'll pull out like headlines and say, okay, what do you think about this? What could have like prevented this? What can we do around ourselves to kind of take action against this? So I think it is providing that space to have conversations at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think the way NEP can address this is just to say that this needs to start from a very, very young age. I think the idea is not that as soon as they hit adolescence, we just ask them the question, what is consent, what is sex? As we've all been saying so far, it's you start from a young age, and in non-physical or sexual related situations, ask them these questions of, can you take somebody's pencil without asking? Can you take somebody's book without asking them? And slowly they understand that consent is basically just asking somebody permission. And I think when you start from a young age, these things are not new or alien to them, and we're suddenly bringing them up at a later age, talking to them about naming their private parts from a very, very young age, and not just suddenly in grade 9 and 10, when we all have, I'm sure, had that class where the teacher just skips the entire chapter and says this is self-study, right? And so therefore we've not actually spoken to kids about this. So we start from a young age, and so that when they reach higher grades and the integration of how all of this comes together from a comprehensive sexuality perspective, digital safety, consent, when all of that comes together with awareness of their own bodies, boundaries, then it sort of starts making sense. But we can't just start at a later age, start from the young age and then slowly keep building it up. I think that's what NEP mandate should be all about. Yeah.
Okay, how can parents be involved so that school education and home values don't conflict but complement each other? Is there an Indian CSE? Should there be a culturally appropriate CSE? What is the Indian? Is there or should there be an Indian CSE?
I can try. I think. So,
well, you're going to encounter this argument, right? It goes against our values, so on and so forth. So should there be an Indian CSE?
Yeah, this has happened, right? So when we talk about these things, one dialogue from a parent saying, this is my belief, this is my family matter, don't get involved. Usually you can't say much beyond that. The only hope, and this is something that I keep talking to everyone about, is every conversation we have about this is a step forward. Just because somebody says this is against our belief or value doesn't mean that this is over. We try to talk about it and ultimately say, hey, yes, we respect your decision, we respect your values. We try to explain to them this is where we're coming from. But I think you're right in saying that should there be an Indian CSE? It's impossible, because we have so many types of, we have religions, we have so many types of belief systems. Every area there's a different belief system, and we have to respect that. At the end of the day, there is, how do we work with the community, and not just because we have said it at the national level, it needs to be implemented. And I think that's why education is a state mandate at the end of the day, because every state has its own beliefs and every region has its own beliefs. So I think it needs to be contextualized for sure. I think there is no one size fits all solution when it comes to CSE in India. It has to be a contextual understanding of that particular community and that area's values. Try to have these conversations, have parent interactions, have parent sessions, and not just student sessions, so that we're all learning and growing together. Because when we do this education, this is not to say that our teachers are already aligned, school leadership is already aligned. It's a process and learning for everyone, right from teachers, parents, students, leadership. We're learning together, and I think as long as we are sort of coming at that perspective and understand the culture and really acknowledge and respect each person in each area's that diversity that India has, I think that's a better way to go about it rather than saying this is the law, follow it. That's my opinion, but I think this is a slightly controversial thing where we have to sort of balance it out. But that's how I would do it. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, I definitely agree with that because I think, especially on the parents' front, there definitely needs to be a little. I think it does go hand in hand, like I already said, there does need to be a lot of positive modeling, but also a lot of like self reflection on messaging from parents themselves, right? Like how parents will have conversations with their kids. So often, I will hear from, especially female students, like my mom called me fat and she, says my skin is dark and this and that. And often that will come from parents or relatives or siblings. And so I think creating that culture at home, again, like I said, it doesn't even often have to be explicit conversations, but it is very much that modeling and the home culture that we are creating. I think the second is, of course, parents have to go hand in hand with any programming that is happening. So, like Devanshi was saying, one of our goals is always to, whenever we work with the school, we also do sessions with the parents. And in fact, these will often be before we do any kind of programming with the kids, where we will tell the parents, okay, we are going to be talking about so and so and so topics, and this is what our learning outcome is going to be, and this is what we want kids to take out of it. So then already at the beginning of the academic year, parents are attuned that, okay, my kids are going to be having these conversations, and how can I potentially reinforce them? So giving them those tools as well. So I think those schools and the parents have to go hand in hand for any curriculum to work. And I think, speaking to Rohit's point also about curriculum, I agree, it absolutely needs to be contextualized. We previously, worked on creating a curriculum, in partnership with another organization, and a lot of what we did was really having examples where the kid can see themselves in those examples. If I'm giving examples of, like, a kid roaming around in like a city or taking like a subway or things like that, those are not things that like a kid will necessarily relate to, right? Which may be kind of more informed by Western realities or what we see in TV, but I think really rooting it in their culture and their day-to-day lives. So kids going for tuitions and things like that, which may be something that is actually more unique in an Indian context. So I think a curriculum that allows them to see themselves in it. I think with values, it is a little bit more tricky because I think it's so easy to slip into the domain of morality all of a sudden, right? So you say, okay, well, this is not our belief and we cannot be having conversations around it. So I think there is like a basic non-negotiable that we have to have, that okay, there needs to be informed decision making, but in order to enable that, we can't just say we'll only give you the information that we want you to have to come to the decision we want you to make, right? So I think there is a little bit of stepping back that we also as a community have to do in order to give young people that space and that chance to come into their own, and they will make mistakes in the process, as all of us have done as we've gone through adolescence and as all of us continue to do as adults. So I think a little bit of stepping back, even as parents, I think sometimes we often have a need to kind of control what our kids are doing, which we hear from schools as feedback all the time. So I think that is also something we collectively might need to work on.
Let me add one example of where this has worked for us. I think Niyati correctly mentioned, right? When you start, before doing these programs, have a session with the parents first. The first time we did this in one of the schools I'm working with, parents said, we don't want you to talk about menstruation. Like, do not talk about it. That's a taboo topic at home. We don't want that. But we said, no, this is something that a child needs to know. Number one, it's there in the curriculum. They need to learn about this in high school. So why not introduce it in middle school itself? Post the program, the same parent came back and said, I'm happy you did this because my son now respects me a lot more when I'm going through my periods. And I think that's something that the fact that, I'm a guy and this was never discussed at home. It was just a monthly, my mom will not enter the kitchen. No questions asked. Right. And I think, and I didn't know what am I supposed to do? Is she going through pain? What is actually happening? And I think this was for me a success point to say, hey, you know what, let's not just do the topic and tell the parent, tell them the why. Post the session, I think they saw the success and why this was important. But it's a challenge. There are, of course, some cases where it's more not a discussion, it's more of a, this is how it is in our house. But I think we have to just take it one step at a time. But it works.
For me, it was eating out. Okay. Supriti Gopalakrishnan, how do we assess the effectiveness of CSE programs? Is there a checklist that we as educators can follow as a guideline within our schools?
I think I can try to answer this one based on a couple of programs that we do. We typically do something called pre and post surveys. And of course, that will not cover the entire gamut of effectiveness of CSE programs, but it does to a great extent show the change in the thinking or show the change in the level of reflection. And we do this both with students and with teachers and parents. So the idea is you give them a set of questions before the program or before the topic is introduced, ask them about on a scale of 1 to 5, what do they think about this, and also some specific instances. And then the idea is after the program is kind of given to them, same set of questions are repeated with a little more reflective questions. So I think that is one good starting point to even understand that is my curriculum even talking to what biases they are sitting with, or is the curriculum actually addressing needs that are not answered for them? So I think that is one very small way to even start gauging the effectiveness of CSE programs, so to say.
I think just to quickly also add, we run this informal network called INSHA, which is essentially a collective of educators and organizations working on comprehensive sexuality education in India. It is a very small space, as you can imagine. And so actually we, as a collective with the entire network, we had members pooling in and sharing their inputs to release a checklist. Which was in fact very much a self-reflective checklist for people. Obviously, it was more catered to those working directly in the field, but also for teachers and educators, that if you are running any kind of programming in classrooms, how can you kind of assess whether that is actually attaining the goals you wanted to? In fact, with this collective, we had actually redefined what sexuality education should mean in an Indian context. So there's a revised, modified definition that we utilize now. But yeah, it also kind of looks at, okay, if I'm doing a PPT, for instance, right? And if I have visuals in that presentation, do those visuals actually represent people of different abilities, of different races, of different colors, ethnicities, religions? And so, making sure that there's that intersectionality in the messaging that we are giving. And it doesn't have to be, okay, I will not have to necessarily say, okay, how does it work in XYZ context? Because there's limited time in any kind of programming, right? But yeah, we do actually have, in fact, a checklist that educators can use to look back at and say, okay, how can I make sure that I'm at least trying to achieve these values? Obviously, 100% is aspirational, but at least it gives you kind of a direction to go in.
Yeah, similar for us. I think there is a pre and post program assessment that we do. What is the awareness levels of students on key concepts before the program and after the program? But I think the other thing that we do is we have an audit that we do twice a year. The idea being before the intervention, what are some basic checklist items that we look for in a school? Do they have a policy? Do they have a child safety committee? Are there ramps in place for physical safety? Are we looking at exposed wiring? Rusted metal? So we have an audit that will soon. We're looking at making it a publicly accessible resource on our website to help quickly for parents and teachers as well to just go around the school to see, in terms of safety, where is my school, level 1, 2, or 3? That is something we're hoping that can help people start having the conversations with their schools, at least for parents to just go and say, hey, you know what, you don't have XYZ, can you do that? Because that's something that I want in my child's school. So that audit is something that we are hopefully will release soon. We're working on it, but
Okay. Swayambhu Soham, they/them. Firstly, parents don't have knowledge about gender spectrum. When I came out, kids and younger generation accepted me than older generation. The older generation were educated, had exposure, but they did not accept and called it vogue. Part of there's a pushback in America against this. The trigger is probably that more and more kids, they think, are declaring themselves, they may have been born male but they're declaring themselves girls, and they're going trans. So there's this, they see, the conservatives who are actually in power, they see an epidemic of gender confusion that is being encouraged by sexuality education. Now, is that something, do you see this, what Soham is saying is something very, very important and pertinent to this issue? I'm just curious to know what you think.
I mean, I'm happy to kind of share at least some insights. I think there is generally like a tendency nowadays for anything that feels new and challenges maybe like our older conceptions as kind of woke. I don't think it is limited to gender identity. I think it has extended far beyond that. It's not just about CSE. I also don't think a lot of these ideas are even necessarily coming from CSE, because even in the US, CSE is a very state-based subject, and there is a very much like a lot of backlash there as well. Even though conversations around sexuality, yes, might be slightly more open, but sexuality education in its structured curricular form that we are talking about, it's not as common to find that even in the US. A lot of the messaging is very fear-based, and a lot of the same barriers that we were talking about very much exist there as well. Same as in the UK as well, because there are very much religious and ideological movements that don't support it. I think the idea of like gender confusion has been, I mean, my understanding is it's been blown out of proportion quite significantly. Really at the end of it, even when we talk to teachers and parents, they're like, oh my God, I don't understand all this terminology. What is LGBTQIA and why are there all these acronyms? And they find it, extremely confusing. But really at the end of it, at the core level, what we're trying to talk about is empathy and respect for another human being, right? Whether they differ from you, whether they believe the same things that you do, or they don't, just having empathy and respect and giving them space to be who they are. And I think really that's where some of the core messaging gets lost, because especially when we're talking about it in schools, right? Like whether or not you get a certain acronym right, whether there is new terminology that you don't fully understand, the end of the day, we're trying to create schools and safer communities for young people, right? Like we already know that LGBTQI children are at higher risk of mental illness, right? Because they are consistently excluded, higher depression rates, higher suicide rates. And really, at the end of the day, what is not going to make them feel excluded is not whether you know the definition of queer or not. It is whether you can make them feel accepted and respected. So it will really come back down to those core values. And I would say very much these ideas are not new. Gender confusion is, gender confusion. I mean, really, as a terminology, I could go into that. But I don't think trans identities are new in any way, shape, or form. I mean, they're very much rooted in Indian culture, in Indian mythology, and really has existed for such a long time. So I think a lot of it is a misnomer, and a lot of it has really been blown out of proportion. I think it's like picking like the most extreme examples and saying, okay, we will only discuss this and only this context, and outside of that, we don't want to have conversations. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a big challenge we come across all the time, but I really feel it strays us away from the heart of what CSE is trying to get at.
Varnika M, she has this question: what if school leaders are promoting? It's a problem. CSE, they are enlightened, so-called, with quote unquote, but there's strong resistance from the parent community. So what do they do?
I can try answering this one. So I think this has happened multiple times when we have done these programs, and I think, like Niyati also suggested, the best thing to do is have a session first for the parents, explaining to them the why behind what we're doing and the idea behind it. Be very honest with them, have an open, honest conversation, and have an open session with the school with the parents about, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it. Do you have any, let's understand your concerns and let's talk it out together. I think we need to look at parents as partners and not just as, they have their own values, and I know what is right for my children, therefore I'm going to do it. I think as long as we look at parents as partners and equal partners, I think this is possible. They will, of course, be resistance. This is a difficult topic to talk about to parents, and because it goes against their idea of what is right and wrong, what they've grown up with, and for that to sort of, it takes time to make the change. So I think doing the session with the parents first and then doing it with the students goes a long way. The other thing that's worked for us is, okay, if there is a topic or two that they really, really object to the program with all the other topics, show them the data for, here is how much the children have improved. Here are the conversations that are happening now because of the program happening in the classroom. We also think adding these two topics next year would really go a long way in helping the children. We have found that has been a lot more successful than just saying straight away, this is what we're going to do from year one. Because this any behavior change model will not happen in 1 year. It takes 3 to 5 to even 7 years. So I think we need to be okay with the fact that this will take time. and approach it from the marathon mindset and not a sprint mindset, I think that really helps.
Anyone else?
No, I think widespread agreement all around. And I think definitely, like Rohit was saying, I think starting with some of those topics that are generally acceptable, like I think there have definitely emerged within CSE themes like consent, like violence prevention. Those tend to be kind of the easier entry points for any school level programming. So beginning there and then kind of allowing it to build up. And a strategy that we were talking about earlier is allowing some of it to come through from kids as well. So when we run our programming and when kids ask those anonymous questions, we then take it back and report to the school that, hey, we've covered these questions, but we're seeing this new subset of questions come from the students, and maybe it warrants further programming. So that also gives us a little bit more foundation to kind of then talk about those topics that have some more pushback.
Meghna Joshi has a follow-up question, so I just fielded it. How can schools support parents in navigating their own discomfort, shame, or silence around sexuality? Parents are opposing, parents are hostile. So how do schools approach parents?
Same thing. I think we just start the conversation somewhere. One thing that helped us is we released a booklet and gave each parent a copy, where we start these conversations to say, first present the data. They just say that, hey, you know what? There's data shows that 54% of children get sexually abused by the time they're 18, and that's an actual data point. And shockingly, there's, as contrary to what people will believe, that there's higher percentage of boys who are sexually abused. So we start from there. Start with the data. Make them understand why this problem is so important. I mean, I don't want to say shock them first, but then explain to them, this is why we're doing this. We're doing this because it's an actual epidemic and endemic in India. This needs to be spoken about, and sort of build up from there. I think it's the same answer as the previous one. We start having conversations, and then the parents are resisting, have one-on-one conversations and go from there. It's a lot of work, but you have to do it.
Okay, Ibrahim Ansari, I'm fielding this question because this is one criticism that comes up. The importance of making youngsters aware of sexual differences and necessary measures to ensure healthy metamorphical transition to responsible adults is beyond question, but teaching sexuality in schools is not that simple a matter. In India, the diverse composite society, because it's taken up by so-called activists representing a micro layer of Indian society. Is it an elitist concept? That's what he's saying.
I mean, at least for me, I don't think it is. I mean, and that is like saying, I will definitely concede to the fact that, like, for instance, a lot of our programming does center around like Delhi NCR, which is absolutely not representative of India in all of its diversity. But that said, we have also worked in partnership with organizations that work, in Rajasthan, in tier 2, tier 3 cities. We worked with organizations that, work in places like Odisha and Tamil Nadu. They will work in like smaller villages. We've had work happen in the Northeast. We've had work happen in tribal communities across India. And I think the need is absolutely there. And I think even though it may differ slightly based on the context, I think some of those core requirements and needs that we're seeing coming from young people pretty much stand the test of this heterogeneity that we have in our society. Now, how that is navigated may look a little bit different, but I would say that sure, you might also say that sexuality education as a terminology maybe feels elitist and maybe doesn't translate as well in other contexts. But that said, it's more so about the content of what is behind that curriculum. It is not what you call it, right? And like I said earlier on as well, I don't mind if we call it something else. I'm not very sticky about it has to be sex education or it doesn't make sense. The only thing is, if you're calling it something else, that should not be a cop-out to not talk about some of the harder topics, right? We can't say we will call it adolescent well-being, but we will not actually talk about safe sexual practices. We will not talk about relationships. We will not talk about pornography. We will not talk about masturbation. It shouldn't be a cop-out because all of those things are very much a part of well-being. So I think that's kind of the piece where I try to like stick to the core values of sexuality education. The terminology may change just as long as it is not a way of like getting out of having the hard conversations. And I think the need is pretty much consistent across India, across different groups, different socioeconomic classes, different ethnicities, different geographic locations. I think that need we have seen with all of our partner organizations come up time and again.
Ibrahim Ansari has a suggestion. He's saying sexuality education for boys should be taught by men, and for girls it should be taught by women, just to facilitate the whole process. Is that a good idea?
Okay, so we've tried both, and I'm going to say this from a perspective of experience. I think this is not to say that female teachers cannot do this for men or men cannot do this for girls, but I think there's a certain comfort level that for certain topics, especially when you're talking about, let's say, hygiene in my private parts, what do you do during your menstrual cycles? If girls ask me a question, I might not have the same answers, that because I've not had that lived experience. And so I think why I would say 95% of safety education can be done regardless of a person's sex. I think there are certain things that unless a person has gone through it, it's going to be difficult to understand why they are telling me what to do. This is what I have also been taught, but I would love to hear if there's an alternate opinion from you guys.
I think I can just jump in here. While I completely agree to Rohit that, of course, lived experiences really kind of create a space to even ask further questions. I feel, but the core of it should not be forgotten in the sense that even if you want, let's say, a male teacher to teach only to male students, I think the differentiation of taking girls outside of the classroom or taking boys outside of the classroom and teaching them separately, I think that is something which really reinforces maybe the stigma around the topic or the need of the conversation. So one other way to look at it is that you have both facilitators, both a female and a male facilitator in the room, and then students are free to ask questions based on their comfort. But when you kind of tag it to a male facilitator teaching to a male student and you remove girls from the room or the other way around, it sometimes tries to reinforce the stigma that we're trying to solve for.
Yeah, I would agree. I think we've also kind of tested out both of these methods as well. We do find that like sometimes younger adolescents especially tend to respond a little bit better to facilitators who might be the same sex as them. That said, I don't think that needs to consistently be the case throughout the programming, right? So like Rohit was saying, it is kind of some niche topics where it might be required, where there may be greater comfort, but most programming can happen with facilitators regardless of their sex or gender. And I think something that we did, for instance, when we ran programming and we were doing kind of sessions around puberty, is we first kind of had a co-educational session where girls and boys and everyone was in the room together, and we then kind of covered the changes across different bodies and different sexes with everybody. And then we separated them only for a Q&A. So there was no new information being imparted. But if there was kind of different comfort levels around asking some of those more specific questions, they still kind of had that space. But it wasn't like there was different learning happening. So it wasn't like, okay, we will only teach the boys this or only teach the girls this. Everybody learns everything. Maybe they have opportunities to ask questions in a more intimate space, which I think students responded to quite well. So I think it has to be a mix, but I don't think we should only go with an approach of, okay, only males will teach males, because we're also at the end of the day trying to teach respect, right? Which is not going to happen if they're only taking one or the other person seriously.
Okay, we have completely run out of time. We've gone over 25 minutes over, and the questions have kept coming, which itself is a good sign, I suppose. We'll end with this question. It's a fear. So she's expressing it, Sandra. Though as a parent, I welcome sex education, especially instilling no gender mindset on children, so they treat all as equals and respect the other gender. But I'm a little concerned about young children. We discussed this before, but she's again flagging it. But a little concerned about young children who are taught about gender identity. Refer to the video on the rise of woke ideas in YouTube by Vijaya Viswanathan, which talks about young kids can think of any gender they want to be. Even some examples of kids pretending to be opposite gender. It's concerning. How is this all monitored? This is a fear. I mean, I don't know if it's prevalent here. It's certainly playing big time in politics, in everything in America. So it may soon happen here too. We did discuss this before, but I want to end with this question.
I mean, I think as previously discussed, I think for me, I think a lot of it is quite.
I mean, they're saying let's keep it taboo. Let's not make it so. let's not give the idea that he or she, the kid, may be undergoing some confusion. So let's not give the idea that let's change gender. And so they decide, okay, I don't like this. I was born a girl, so let me be a boy. Or a boy who wants to be a girl. Oh, right, I'm feeling confused. I don't know. I'm feeling effeminate. So let me change gender. So that is the fear among parents. How would you address that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, honestly, we even before, like I said, I feel a lot of it is blown out of proportion, and I think a lot of it is fear-based messaging that all of a sudden your kid is going to want to go undergo like gender reassignment surgery, which is quite frankly not that easy, even if you had the idea. Like, it's portrayed as something that is so easy, and like tomorrow you could change your mind and all of that. It is very much not the case. And I think even in general, like it's quite natural sexual development as well. Like even before these conversations on social media, even before like social media being a big thing, we've always had cases of young boys being interested in like their mother's makeup, trying out saris, and very often it's just a developmental phase that they might go through. And even if they don't, it is a process of exploration and identity formation. So I think it is important to give them that space. I think this whole gender change idea, it's really really not as easy and as convenient as one makes it seem. And even if that is a choice that a kid makes, I think we are at the end of the day trying to like create this more accepting society at the end of the day, right? Like I think the fear really comes from, oh, what will people think of me as a parent? And a lot of it is like, okay, what will they think of me if my kid is doing that? And I think if that is our first priority, then we've probably lost the plot already.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Niyati has already said this. I think a lot of this is, I would not say blown out of proportion. I think the thing is, it's portrayed in a certain negative way, and that's typical left versus right mindset, right? And I think the left is constantly trying to put down the right, right is constantly trying to put down the left. But I think what's happening here is we are forgetting about the core of what the sexuality education is by just honing on this one issue, which they seem to have a problem with. And I think one is, there's definitely insecurity, and two, lack of acceptance that a child can explore different ways in which to live. And I think it just boils down ultimately to stereotypes. So I think once we have those conversations on because I think the fundamental misunderstanding is sex and gender, and I think that misunderstanding itself is causing a lot of fear with people. And I think there is sex, there's gender, and within gender, there's gender stereotypes, and within there are gender affirmations. There's so much to unpack there, and I think that's exactly why we need to have these conversations. Give children the clarity of what exactly is what, and then build off from there. I think there's definitely the person who's asked this question also mentioned this is from a YouTube video. So YouTubers generally do tend to put these things to get those views, but that isn't to say it's not their concerns or whatever is just to get that, to sensationalize it. But I think there is an element of it being blown out of proportion. Yeah.
I think one small thing I want to add, and I don't know if this helps the parent, but there's no data around this. There's absolutely no data at the moment that states that if I give more education about the gender spectrum to my child, the child will want to explore more. There is no data behind this fact. So I think like every other topic in CSC, which is a bit difficult to talk about, even this lies on the same lines, and not talking about it might not do great justice to it. So yeah.
All right, we need to wind up. We had an excellent discussion. Lots of good points, insights, a little bit of controversies too. So it does seem that the needle will start moving. I suppose the next new education policy will have to deal with this issue and introduce it in some form or the other. Is that an Indian way to do it? We don't know. We don't know yet. Maybe there is something that they can come up with. But thanks, really. I thank all the panelists, and also those who came onto the webinar. They asked very interesting, important, and insightful questions. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next week, Saturday, 5 p.m. in another education webinar by The Hindu. Thank you.